An aging assassin, once feared and forgotten, is humiliated by a young thug in a bar. But when the old man's past resurfaces, it ignites a deadly game where no one is safe, not even the man who thought he could control everything. Will revenge restore his honor, or is he already too far gone? The dim glow of old light bulbs flickered inside Donna Rosa's cantina, a small, dusty bar that smelled of cheap liquor and sweat. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the wooden floor creaked under the weight of time, and countless stories whispered over bottles of tequila. At a far table, sitting alone, was Miguel Vasquez, his wrinkled hands wrapped around a glass of mezcal, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the rim. To most, he was just an old man, a relic of the past, slow and fragile. At the bar, Rafa Ortega leaned against the counter, a smirk stretching across his face as he watched Miguel. Carlos and Luis, his ever-loyal shadows, chuckled at his side. "Look at him," Rafa scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The ghost of a man clinging to a drink like it's his last." Luis snorted. "Maybe it is." The insult lingered in the air, but Miguel remained still, unfazed. Rafa wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted to break something. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward Miguel's table, dragging a chair and sitting across from him. The young thug reeked of arrogance, his presence an unwelcome storm disturbing the bar's quiet atmosphere. "You know," Rafa began, voice dripping with mockery, "I hear you used to be something. Dangerous, even." He chuckled, nudging Carlos. "Hard to believe looking at you now. Just a crippled old man with nothing left but stories." Carlos and Luis snickered. Miguel lifted his eyes, dark and unreadable. He said nothing. Rafa grinned wider. "Come on, viejo, say something. Show me there's still a spark in those hollow eyes of yours." Silence. That only angered Rafa more. He glanced down at the bamboo cane resting against the table, Miguel's only visible sign of weakness. With a sudden move, Rafa grabbed it. The bar fell into a tense hush. Even the old radio in the corner seemed to quiet its static hum. "You won't mind if I borrow this, right?" Rafa asked, though he didn't wait for an answer. Miguel remained motionless. "Let's see just how much this means to you." With a cruel smirk, Rafa snapped the cane in two, the sharp crack cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The pieces fell to the floor, useless, broken. A gasp came from somewhere in the bar. Donna Rosa behind the counter closed her eyes, already regretting what she had witnessed. The older patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew. They remembered. Miguel finally moved. Slowly he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes met Rafa's with a calmness so deep it was unsettling. Something inside Rafa twisted. For the first time that night, he felt it. A quiet, creeping sense of danger. But the feeling passed and he forced a laugh, slapping Carlos on the back. "See that? Nothing. Just a shadow of a man." Carlos and Luis laughed along, though less confidently than before. Miguel picked up his glass, took a sip, and placed it back down, careful, deliberate. His hand did not shake. His breath did not waver. Then he spoke. "Enjoy your night, muchacho." Just that, nothing more. Rafa sneered, but for some reason he didn't push further. Something about that voice, that unshaken tone, sent a shiver through him. With a scoff, he turned away, signaling his men to leave. The moment they stepped outside, the noise in the bar resumed, though it was laced with unease. Donna Rosa watched as Miguel reached down, picking up the shattered remains of his cane. His fingers curled around the broken wood, his grip tightening just slightly. She had seen that look before, and for the first time in years, she feared what was coming next. Miguel Vasquez walked through the dimly lit streets, his steps slow but steady. The night air was cool, whispering through the narrow alleys of the old neighborhood. He carried the broken pieces of his cane in one hand, his fingers tracing the splintered wood. It was not the loss of the cane that occupied his mind. It was what it represented. Reaching his small apartment, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was sparse, almost barren. A single wooden chair, a rickety table, and a mattress on the floor. The walls, cracked with age, bore no decorations, except for one thing. In the far corner of the room sat a small wooden box, its surface worn by time. Miguel set the broken cane aside and knelt before it. His fingers hovered over the lid, hesitant. It had been years since he had last opened it. With a quiet breath, he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled beneath an old folded cloth, lay a blade, a karambit, curved and deadly, its steel gleaming faintly in the dim light. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hand. His fingers curled around the handle, and for a moment his reflection stared back at him in the polished edge. His mind drifted. He saw faces, men who had once feared his name, enemies whose last moments had been silent, swift. He remembered the thrill of moving unseen, the precision of a strike well placed. The world had once whispered his name with caution, El Silencio. But that was a different life, a life he had chosen to leave behind, or so he had thought. Miguel set the knife down, exhaling slowly. He had spent years trying to escape what he was, but tonight had reminded him of a simple truth. No matter how deep one buries the past, it never stays buried. Meanwhile, across town, Rafa Ortega basked in his victory. The bar was alive with laughter and clinking glasses. Rafa sat at a table near the back, surrounded by his men. He recounted the scene again and again, embellishing the details each time. And then, crack, he exclaimed, mimicking the motion of breaking the cane. You should have seen his face. Not even a flicker of emotion. Just sat there like a damn statue. Carlos chuckled, though his fingers still rubbed at his sore knuckles. Maybe he was too scared to react. Rafa grinned, tossing back a shot of tequila. That's what I'm saying. The old man's nothing but a ghost now. Whatever legend he used to be, it's long dead. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm. At the bar, Donna Rosa watched in silence, drying a glass with deliberate care. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held something close to pity. An older man sitting nearby, his face lined with the weight of experience, leaned toward Rafa's table. He did not smile. You're a fool, he muttered. The laughter stopped. Rafa turned, his cocky smirk faltering. What did you say, viejo? The man exhaled through his nose, taking a slow sip of his drink. You don't even realize what you've done, do you? His gaze was heavy, knowing. That man you humiliated tonight, you think you shamed him? No. He shook his head. You woke him up. Rafa scoffed, but the weight of the words settled uncomfortably in his chest. He forced another laugh, waving the old man off. You talk like he's some kind of myth. Donna Rosa finally spoke. That's because he is. The table fell silent. For the first time that night, doubt crept into Rafa's mind. He looked around the bar, noticing the unease in the older patrons' faces, the way they averted their eyes. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere, alone in his apartment, Miguel Vasquez sharpened his blade. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the city as Carlos made his way through the streets. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what had transpired at Donna Rosa's bar. The laughter, the insults, the broken cane. It was too easy. He kept replaying Rafa's words in his head. Nothing but a ghost. But now, walking through the deserted streets, Carlos had the nagging feeling that they had made a grave mistake. There had been something in Miguel's eyes, something that had unsettled him, a quiet, hidden danger that he couldn't shake. Carlos found himself at the small, dingy workshop where he worked as a mechanic. He slid the door open and stepped inside, feeling the cold air of the building against his skin. The sounds of tools clinking and engines humming seemed distant as his thoughts wandered back to Miguel. It was then that he felt it, a sharp pain in his left hand. Looking down, he saw his hand twitching uncontrollably. Blood dripped from his fingers. His mind didn't register what had happened, not until he heard the loud, sickening crunch that echoed through the shop. Carlos screamed as his hand was crushed under the weight of an unseen force. It felt as though his bones were turning to dust. He fell to the ground, clutching his mangled hand, but there was no one around. The pain was unbearable, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no warning, only the silent terror that seemed to be closing in on him. Meanwhile, Rafa Ortega was pacing back and forth in the back room of the bar, his impatience growing by the second. He had sent Luis to check on Carlos hours ago, but the man still hadn't returned. Rafa's temper was rising. Where the hell is he? He muttered, glancing at the clock. I told him to take care of things, not to disappear. Rafa's mind began to wander back to the night before. He couldn't shake the image of Miguel sitting there unfazed as his cane shattered. The old man had said nothing, yet Rafa felt watched. Suddenly, the door to the back room swung open and Luis entered, his face pale. His hands were trembling. Rafa, Luis began, his voice barely above a whisper. Carlos, He's in trouble. Rafa's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, in trouble? Luis swallowed hard. He's hurt. Bad. His hand, it's crushed. Rafa felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had seen men with broken limbs, torn flesh, but this was different. Did he see who did it? Rafa asked, his voice a low growl. Luis shook his head, still pale. No one was there. He was alone, but it's bad, Rafa. Real bad. Rafa stared at Luis, his mind racing. He knew one thing for sure, this wasn't a coincidence. You think it was the old man? Luis asked, his voice uncertain. Rafa clenched his fists. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. It wasn't long before the two of them made their way to Miguel's apartment. The building was old, the paint peeling from the walls, but it was a place that had seen more than its fair share of stories. Rafa didn't expect the old man to be hiding. No, he was too proud for that. As they approached the door, Rafa felt a familiar chill crawl down his spine. The air around him felt heavy, oppressive. He knocked, his fist striking the door 3 times, each strike louder than the last. No response. He pushed the door open. Inside, the apartment was empty, except for one thing. There, resting on the table, was the karambit. Rafa's breath caught in his throat. The blade gleamed in the dim light, its sharp edge catching the rays of the morning sun. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice from the shadows. You should have stayed away, muchacho. Miguel stepped out from the corner, his silhouette looming in the doorway. His eyes were cold, his face emotionless. Rafa's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in years, he felt the grip of fear tighten around his chest. The moment the door creaked open, the tension in the room shifted, like a storm had suddenly materialized out of thin air. Miguel Vasquez stood in the shadows, his face expressionless, eyes sharp as ever. Rafa froze for a second, heart pounding in his chest. You're still alive, Rafa muttered, his voice tight. Miguel didn't answer immediately. He stepped further into the room, his presence overwhelming. His gait was slow, deliberate, almost like a predator toying with its prey. The gleam of the karambit in his hand caught the light, casting a flash of silver across the room. You made a mistake, Miguel finally said, his voice low and calm, though it carried the weight of an unspoken warning. I warned you. Rafa's bravado faltered. His jaw tightened as he reached for the gun tucked under his jacket, his hand shaking just slightly. You think you can scare me, old man? Miguel didn't flinch. He merely watched as Rafa's hand hesitated, his eyes never leaving the younger man's face. You've already made your choice, Miguel said simply, his tone growing colder. But you're playing with fire now, and fire always burns. Before Rafa could react, Luis stepped back, glancing nervously at the door. Rafa, we should... No, Rafa growled, cutting him off. I'm not afraid of him. Miguel raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening on the blade. You should be. The moment those words left his lips, it was like the room itself held its breath. Time seemed to slow, as if the air was thick with something dangerous, ready to snap. Rafa stepped forward, his finger tightening on the trigger of the gun. The tension was palpable, but Miguel was already a step ahead. With blinding speed, Miguel moved. The blade flashed through the air in a perfect arc. Rafa barely had time to react. The bullet he had aimed at Miguel whizzed past, hitting the wall instead, while Miguel's blade sliced across Rafa's forearm in one smooth motion. Rafa grunted in pain, dropping the gun as he staggered back, clutching his bleeding arm. Luis's eyes widened in shock, but before he could move, Miguel had already turned his attention to him. The old man was everywhere at once, his movements almost invisible, too quick for the eye to track. Luis's body slammed into the wall, his legs buckling under the weight of a swift, brutal strike. His breath left him in a forced gasp, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap. Rafa watched in horror as Miguel dispatched his men with terrifying precision. Luis lay gasping for air, his face contorted in pain. Carlos's injury had been a warning, but now it was clear. Miguel wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a force to be reckoned with. In a panic, Rafa stumbled back, his hand clutching his bleeding arm. You can't do this! Miguel slowly approached, the gleam of the blade still visible in the dim light. I warned you, he repeated, his voice emotionless. Rafa's eyes were wide with fear, his mind racing for a way out, but there was no escape. There was only the cold, silent inevitability of his fate. I'm not going to beg for my life, Rafa spat, though his voice trembled. You're just a washed-up old man. No one cares about you anymore. Miguel stopped in front of him, his face inches from Rafa's. The air between them was thick, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "I've never asked for anyone's care," Miguel said softly, his eyes locking onto Rafa's with a piercing intensity. "I only ask for respect." Rafa stared back at him, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had no words left. The arrogance, the bravado, the cocky confidence that had once made him untouchable, it was all gone. With one final movement, Miguel reached out and grabbed Rafa by the collar, pulling him close. Rafa's breath caught in his throat as Miguel whispered into his ear, "Now you know what happens when you play with fire." And just like that, the room fell silent. The only sound was Rafa's shallow breathing, the only movement the slight shiver of fear that ran down his spine. Miguel released his grip and turned away, leaving the room as quickly as he had entered. His footsteps were the only thing that remained in the silence that followed. As he walked out, his silhouette fading into the shadows, Rafa's mind raced. He had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the old man. But worse, he had underestimated what he had once been. The early morning mist clung to the streets, the city still dark and quiet as Rafa sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with the events of the previous night. His arm throbbed with pain, but the humiliation he had endured was far worse. He had thought himself invincible, untouchable, but now, all he could feel was fear. Miguel's words echoed in his mind, growing louder with every passing second. When you play with fire, you get burned. He had made a dangerous enemy, and now, with his men defeated, his reputation in shambles, there was only one person left to turn to. Rafa glanced over at Luis, still nursing his wounds, but looking every bit as defeated. "We have to go to my uncle," Rafa said, his voice strained. "Don Esteban will help us. He'll know what to do." Luis, his face pale, nodded slowly. "But Rafa, you saw what he did. He's not just an old man, he's something else, something dangerous." Rafa shot him a look, his eyes burning with anger. "I don't care. My uncle is Don Esteban Ortega, one of the most powerful men in this city. If anyone can handle this, it's him." The car sped through the streets, and as they neared the old part of town, the building that housed Don Esteban's offices loomed into view. The mansion was grand, imposing, its iron gates a symbol of power and influence that stretched far beyond what Rafa could comprehend. Inside, the old man was waiting, Don Esteban Ortega, a legend in his own right. He was a man who had seen it all, who had played the game of crime with a level of mastery that few could match. His hair was white now, his face wrinkled with the years of experience, but his eyes, those eyes were still sharp, calculating. He was not a man who feared anyone, and he certainly did not fear Miguel Vasquez. Rafa stepped into the lavish office, his uncle sitting behind a massive desk made of dark wood. The room smelled of expensive cigars, and a large painting of Don Esteban's younger days hung on the wall behind him. He raised an eyebrow as Rafa and Luis entered, his gaze flickering to Rafa's injured arm. "What happened to you?" Don Esteban's voice was low, yet it carried an undeniable authority. Rafa winced but held his ground. "It's nothing, Uncle. I've got a problem that requires your attention." Don Esteban leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Go on." Rafa hesitated for a moment, but then began. "It's Miguel Vasquez. He's still alive. We had a run-in with him last night, and he's not the same man he used to be. Rafa trailed off, the words failing him. Don Esteban's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the desk. "El Silencio. I know who he is." Rafa's heart sank at the mention of the name. El Silencio, the legend, the ghost that haunted the streets. "You should have left him alone," Don Esteban said, his voice calm but filled with a strange sense of gravity. "Miguel Vasquez is not someone you challenge lightly." "But he's just an old man," Rafa insisted, the arrogance in his voice returning. "What can he possibly do? He's no longer the monster he once was." Don Esteban smiled faintly, a bitter smile that barely touched the corners of his lips. "You don't understand, Rafa. Miguel Vasquez was a ghost. The stories about him? They weren't just stories. He is the story." Rafa's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" Don Esteban leaned back in his chair, eyes focused on Rafa, with an intensity that made him feel like a boy being lectured. "I know the man you're talking about, and I know the man you've provoked. El Silencio is not dead. He's merely been sleeping." Rafa's face paled. "Then what do we do?" Don Esteban stood up, walking over to a cabinet and pulling out a small box. He opened it slowly, revealing a set of fine cigars, each one carefully rolled and placed inside. He lit one, inhaling deeply before offering it to Rafa. "You stay away from him," Don Esteban said simply. "And you let him live his life, because if you don't, you'll regret it. Trust me, this is not a fight you want." Rafa looked at his uncle, his thoughts racing. He had never seen the old man this serious, this reluctant. There was a deep respect, even fear, in his voice. Rafa felt the weight of his uncle's words settle on him, and for the first time, the reality of the situation hit him hard. He wasn't dealing with some old man. He was dealing with a legend, a man who had lived in the shadows and who had now been awakened. The morning light had barely pierced the horizon when Rafa Ortega sat in the back of a dimly lit car, his mind churning with anxiety. Don Esteban's warning had stuck with him. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "We need to finish this," he muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the leather seat. "We can't let him keep humiliating us." Sitting next to him, Luis shifted uneasily. His face was bruised, and the fear in his eyes was palpable. "Rafa, maybe we should reconsider. The old man, he's not like the others. We're not ready for him." Rafa's eyes narrowed as he stared out the window. "I don't have a choice. We've already come too far. We'll get him to meet us on our terms. He'll be cornered, and then we end this." The decision had been made. They had come up with a plan, a trap. Rafa's men had been instructed to approach Miguel with an offer, a peace agreement. A simple meeting in a desolate warehouse on the outskirts of town, far away from any witnesses. If Miguel accepted, they would strike quickly. But if he didn't, Rafa was prepared for that too. Back in the familiar surroundings of Dona Rosa's bar, the mood was tense. The usual chatter had been replaced by whispers, the older patrons casting wary glances at the door. Dona Rosa cleaned a glass, her movements mechanical. She knew what was coming. She had seen it all before, but this time she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. A few hours passed, and then a knock on the door. Miguel stood there, his back straight, his expression calm, but his eyes were cold and unyielding. "Dona Rosa," he said, his voice low, "I know what they're planning." She looked up, startled, but then her face softened with concern. "Miguel, you can't go. It's a trap. They'll kill you." Miguel smiled faintly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know." He turned to leave, but Dona Rosa caught his arm. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "They don't understand. You don't have to do this." Miguel gently removed her hand. "It's already done. If they want war, I'll give it to them." The door swung open behind him, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. Miguel didn't need to hear the footsteps following him as he walked into the street. He knew the trap was already set. He reached the warehouse with calculated precision, the sounds of his footsteps echoing in the empty, desolate space. There was no movement, no sign of anyone waiting. It was eerily quiet, just the hum of distant traffic in the background. Then, the doors slammed shut. The heavy sound reverberated in the air. He was surrounded. Out of the shadows emerged Rafa, his face twisted in a grin. His men were positioned around the perimeter of the room, weapons raised. Luis, still looking terrified, stood nervously behind them. "You made a mistake coming here, old man," Rafa sneered, stepping forward. "You're not walking out of here." Miguel's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. The positions of the men, the exit routes, the shadows. His mind worked faster than his heart could beat. "I came here for one thing," Miguel replied, his voice cold, his gaze never leaving Rafa. "And that's to finish what you started." He wasn't surprised by the ambush. He had known it was coming. Miguel moved, his body a blur of grace and deadly intent. He stepped toward the nearest thug, disarming him with a swift twist of the wrist. The man fell to the ground with a yelp, but Miguel was already on to the next. Each movement was fluid, controlled, like a dance with death. One by one, the men fell, their weapons ineffective against Miguel's precision. Rafa's face contorted with rage as he shouted for them to regroup. But the old man was already too far ahead. Miguel wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature, moving too fast to be caught. Luis tried to make a run for it, but Miguel anticipated his move. With a single swift strike, Luis dropped to the ground, unconscious before he could even scream. Rafa, alone now with his men scattered on the floor, tried to regain control, his fear mounting. "No more games, old man. "You're finished." Miguel paused for a moment, his chest rising and falling slowly. "I told you." He took a step closer to Rafa. "You don't play with fire without getting burned." In one smooth motion, Miguel moved toward Rafa, his blade flashing in the dim light. Rafa's world went dark. The warehouse fell into silence once more. The streets were silent in the aftermath of the violence. The night had swallowed the remnants of the battle, leaving only the echo of footsteps on the concrete. Miguel walked through the alleyways, his pace measured, his movements calm despite the storm that had just passed. The warehouse lay behind him, its windows shattered, the bodies of Rafa's men scattered like broken dolls across the floor. The flicker of the streetlights cast long shadows on the ground as Miguel made his way toward the city's edge. He had done what needed to be done, but it wasn't over yet. The mission was clear: eliminate the threat, restore the balance, and move on. But something about tonight felt different. The air had changed. There was a tension, a sense that things were spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion. As Miguel rounded a corner, he saw the distant figure of Luis, staggering down the street. The man was alive, though barely. His clothes were torn, his face pale, but he was breathing. Luis looked up and saw Miguel. There was no fear in his eyes, only defeat. The young man dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. "Please," he whispered. You don't understand. He made us do it. We didn't know what we were getting into." Miguel paused for a moment, studying him. Luis was broken. The fire that had once burned in his eyes was now extinguished. He was a mere shadow of the man who had once served Rafa. "You should have stayed away," Miguel said quietly. He didn't need to say more. Luis already knew. With a final resigned look, Miguel turned and continued his path. Luis had chosen his fate the moment he joined Rafa. There was nothing left to be said. But as Miguel walked away, he felt the weight of Rafa's last words in his mind. "You'll regret this." Miguel had never regretted a decision in his life, but the words gnawed at him, a reminder that this wasn't over. Rafa's death had sent a message, but it had also set something else in motion, a chain of events that could not be stopped. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office at the heart of the city, Don Esteban Ortega sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface. The report had come in. Rafa was dead, along with most of his men. The warehouse was a bloodbath, the entire operation a failure. Don Esteban's face remained calm, but there was a coldness in his eyes, a calculating look that suggested he had been expecting this. He had warned them. "El silencio," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "The old ghost is awake." The phone on his desk rang, cutting through the silence. He picked it up, his voice steady as ever. "Yes?" The voice on the other end was sharp, urgent. "Don Esteban, the situation is spiraling out of control. The men you sent to handle Miguel, they've all been wiped out. The city is on edge. El Silencio has sent a message." Don Esteban's eyes narrowed. "I know. I've seen it coming." He paused, his gaze distant. "Prepare my car. We're going to meet him." Back in the shadows of the city, Miguel moved with purpose. He had expected resistance, but he had never feared it. The old ghost had returned, and now the world would have to reckon with the consequences. As he walked deeper into the heart of the city, he could feel the weight of the legend pressing on him. There were whispers, rumors already starting to circulate. El Silencio was back. And this time he would not fade into the shadows so easily. Miguel's footsteps echoed in the alley, a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Each step took him closer to a confrontation that was inevitable. Don Esteban had made his move, but Miguel was not the hunted. He was the hunter, and he would make sure that no one ever underestimated him again. The streets were quieter now, the chill of the night settling into every corner. Miguel moved through the city with a sense of inevitability, as though the final act had already been written, and all that remained was to play it out. His steps were measured, his thoughts focused on the task ahead. He had known this day would come, the moment when the past would catch up with him, when he would have to face Don Esteban Ortega, the man who had built an empire on fear and control. The wind whispered through the alleyways as Miguel approached the gates of Don Esteban's mansion, a fortress in the heart of the city. The old man was waiting for him. Of that Miguel was certain. The game had shifted, but the stakes were now higher than ever. As Miguel stepped closer to the gate, the sound of footsteps behind him caught his attention. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. He had felt the presence long before the footsteps reached him. A car pulled up beside him, its engine humming softly in the stillness of the night. The door opened and Don Esteban stepped out, his face lined with years of experience, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Miguel Vasquez," Don Esteban said, his voice low but commanding. "I had a feeling you would come." Miguel remained silent for a moment, studying the man before him. He had never feared Don Esteban, but now there was a quiet respect in his gaze. The old man had survived in this world for a reason. He was not a fool. "You've caused quite a stir," Don Esteban continued, his voice steady. "I warned my nephew about you, but he didn't listen. Now look where we are." Miguel finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Your nephew made his choice. I only acted in self-defense." Don Esteban's lips curled into a faint smile. "Self-defense, you say? You could have walked away, Miguel. You didn't have to do this." Miguel took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Don Esteban's. "I don't walk away from threats. I eliminate them." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence born from years of rivalry, of unsaid things, and unresolved history. "You've become a legend, you know," Don Esteban said, his tone almost thoughtful. "El Silencio, the ghost who strikes from the shadows. But legends always fade, Miguel, and so will you." Miguel's gaze never wavered. "I've never been a legend. I'm a man who does what he must, and right now, I must end this." Without another word, Miguel stepped forward. The karambit gleamed in the dim light, its edge sharp and deadly. He didn't need to say anything more. Don Esteban's hand moved toward his jacket, where a gun was hidden. But before he could draw it, Miguel was already upon him. With the speed of a predator, Miguel closed the distance between them, and in a blur of motion, the karambit flashed through the air. Don Esteban's eyes widened in shock as the blade sliced through the air. He staggered back, but Miguel was too quick. In a fluid motion, he twisted Don Esteban's arm, disarming him in a single strike. The old man fell to his knees, clutching his wounded arm. You've won!" Don Esteban gasped, his breath shallow. "But you're making a mistake!" Miguel knelt down to face him, his eyes cold and unwavering. "The only mistake I made was letting you live this long." And with that, the legend of El Silencio reached its final act. Don Esteban looked up at Miguel, his expression filled with a mix of defeat and understanding. He had underestimated the old man, just as everyone else had, and now it was too late. With one final strike, Miguel ended the man who had controlled the city with an iron fist for so long. The world around them seemed to pause. The city, the streets, the shadows. They all stood still, as if waiting for the final breath of the man who had once been untouchable. But Miguel Vasquez remained a silent ghost, his task complete. The streets would never be the same, but neither would he. With Don Esteban's death, the city fell into an uneasy silence. The power vacuum left in his wake was felt across the streets, yet no one dared to claim it. His empire crumbled, but the shadows that once feared him now whispered of a different kind of terror, the kind that didn't need words to be heard. Miguel stood over the fallen body of his old rival, his breath steady, his face emotionless. He had restored balance, but not with the promises of violence and dominance that Don Esteban had once used. No, Miguel's way was simple, quiet, decisive, and final. In the distance, a siren echoed, but the world didn't change. It simply moved on. For the first time in years, Miguel could hear the city breathe without fear, without the constant hum of power and corruption that had tainted every corner. As Miguel walked away from the mansion, his footsteps were absorbed by the silence. The legend of El Silencio was no longer just a myth. It had become the truth. And in that truth, order was restored. As Miguel walked through the quiet streets, he knew that his time in the city had come to an end. The legend that had been buried for so long was now awakened, and its presence had reshaped the world around him. There were whispers already, rumors of El Silencio, the ghost who had returned to restore the balance. They didn't know who he was, only that the city had changed. The fear that had once consumed the underworld was gone, replaced by a new order, one where actions spoke louder than words. Miguel's journey had been long, but he had never sought fame. His path had always been one of silence, and in that silence, he had found his peace. He didn't need the recognition, didn't need the world to acknowledge him. He had done what was necessary, and now it was time to leave. As he walked away from the city, his silhouette slowly faded into the horizon. The legend of El Silencio would live on, whispered in the shadows, waiting for the next time the world needed him. But for now, there was nothing left to do but walk away in silence. In the end, Miguel Vasquez teaches us a powerful lesson. No matter how far we've fallen or how much we've been humiliated, our past does not define us. The choices we make in our darkest moments shape who we truly are. Miguel could have walked away, but instead he chose to confront his demons head-on, reminding us that sometimes the greatest act of strength is facing the consequences of our past with courage and determination. How would you have acted if you were in his shoes? Would you have chosen to confront the challenges, or would you have let the weight of the past dictate your future? Now, if you're ready to dive deeper into the journey of self-discovery and explore how you can apply these lessons to your own life, click on the video that's on your screen. Subscribe to continue exploring how stories like Miguel's can inspire real change in our own lives. It's time to take control and embark on your path to personal growth. Don't miss out. Click now and let the journey begin.